all we've been doing is breaking down the plywood portions of the build, which is going to consist of a top, bottom, 2 sides, 2 vertical partitions, and 2 shelves. We did this with a combination of a table saw and a track saw. And the first of those steps is going to be cutting our 4 outside pieces to size. Basically, instead of starting with our horizontal cuts, we're going to start with our vertical cuts. And the reason for this is you have almost no control in determining the length of the piece when you're making your vertical cuts. But with the horizontal cuts, you can set your fence to dial things in just where you want them in the end. Really what I do is shoot roughly for whatever size I want when I'm cutting my top and side panels, no math required, just whatever's in the neighborhood of what I had in mind. Instead, I just use some tape to do a quick dry assembly of my top and side panels, make a first cut on my bottom panel, hold it up to my other pieces, mark a line, and then take a few passes on the table saw, just sneaking up on the line until it fits just right. So I'm not shooting for a number, rather just cutting it to fit a gap. Okay, the next thing we want to do is get some thin hardwood strips on the fronts of the pieces that'll eventually become the vertical partitions and the shelves. Then you're going to glue it on, and you can use some tape or some fancy clamps. Once that's had time to dry, you can trim off the excess any number of ways. Personally, I like using my table saw with a jig that holds the surface of the plywood perfectly in line with the blade, so just the overhanging material gets cut free. Before we glue them up, we're going to need to cut some dados and rabbets into them. Now, conventional wisdom would tell you that you need to cut dados into the top and bottom pieces to accept the vertical partitions. But you'll notice that I'm only cutting them into the bottom pieces, and you're going to see why in just a minute. But in any case, you're going to cut 2 of those and then rabbets along the backs of all 4 pieces. And here we're just going to use the tape method. Sometimes I'll use dominoes in these joints to reinforce them, but honestly the biggest benefit to that for me is just that it helps make the glue up go more smoothly when you just have one set of hands. By the next morning the case was nice and dry and we could start fitting our vertical partitions. So we started by cutting one edge of each piece nice and square. So at this point the vertical partitions are sized just right, but before we install them, we're going to cut another set of dados into these pieces, which are going to eventually hold the shelves. Then to make sure that they don't move, I'm going to cut these little scrap pieces of walnut out and glue them to the underside of the top. And this is something that nobody's ever going to see unless they're really obsessed with this piece and are willing to get down on their hands and knees. Next we can put our blade back to 90 degrees, hold that piece up to the cabinet, and mark out a line where we need to cut it so that it fits just right. Then we'll take a few passes, erring on the side of too long, until it fits just right. So here I'm ripping a few pieces of walnut to about 1 1/4 inches wide. Then it's really just a matter of working your way around the perimeter, matching the angles, and cutting your pieces to length. The pieces we used had a little bit more curve in them than I would have liked, and we ended up having to nail them in to get them to hold flat. Either way, while gluing them on, I want them to be proud mostly on the inside edge of the cabinet, but with the outside I'm also going to leave them ever so slightly proud. And that's so that we can get a really clean and flush look after they dry by using a flush trim bit on the router. Now let's set the cabinet aside for a bit and start making our base. We started off by making a few templates of our leg shapes, and you could do this with a CNC if you have one. I used my X-Carve, but I've also shown how to do this by hand in another video, so I'm going to link to that below. And actually Sean has a whole video about this on his channel, so I'm also going to link to that. From there we could cut the pieces free using a table saw, and then roughed out the general shape on the bandsaw. After that, we use some templating bits on the router to mimic the shapes. And you'll notice in these shots that we're leaving some parts, namely the end grain and the parts where the connections will be made. and we'll get to those in a minute on the table saw using a sled. So here we're going to make a quick sled jig for cutting the end grains and the connecting faces. So we start by setting the fence and taking one pass to establish a cut line. And what's important here is that we don't touch the fence again after we've done this. Next we use the template that we had made to line up exactly where we need to cut our connecting face. And I should say, this is a non-crucial cut. You just want to be close and consistent. Then we could put our actual work pieces in and make the cuts to clear away the material. So at this point we can go ahead and do an initial glue up. And that's going to consist of gluing the two shorter pieces together and all of the little support blocks that go on the connecting faces. And right now we're just very crudely cutting those out, and we're going to attach them as some oversized blocks. And once that was done, we're going to go through the exact same process again of roughing out the shape on the bandsaw, template routing the bulk of it, and then using a sled to make some final cuts on the end grain. The next step was to make some drawer boxes, and we decided to class it up with some bloom drawer slides. Okay, so Sean's put together our 3 drawer boxes, and now we can start attaching the hardware. Here I used the Cat's Moses dovetail jig to make a perpendicular 90-degree cut in the back of my boxes. And I think the hardware goes through this notch, if I recall correctly. These holes I'm drilling here are for support pins that hold the back of the drawer up. In any case, once that's all done, installing the hardware itself is actually really easy. Just a pair of clips on the underside front of the drawer box, and then the slider in the cabinet. And once these things are in, I have to say that they're super smooth and really nice. Top quality stuff. Works like a plum. With the drawer boxes in, I could start making the drawer faces. So here I'm prepping my pieces. And what I usually like to do here is measure my opening, factor in my gaps, and that tells me the size that my drawer faces should be. Then I cut them out just ever so slightly wider than they actually need to be. For the length, I'm going to go ahead and finalize that right now, and I just want to make sure that all 3 are exactly the same. Before we attach them, we need to cut in some handles. So I made myself 2 templates that look like this. One of these will be for the drawer boxes, and the other ones are going to be for the drawer faces. And this way the drawer box won't be seen or felt when you go to pull the drawers open. So using the templates, I roughed out the material using a jigsaw, and then used my router with a flush trim bit to clean it up. At this point, I could start installing. And basically I'm going to start from the bottom and work my way up. And one of the cool things about these handles is a clamp can fit right in the opening, which makes it really easy to hold them in position while you screw them in. Now, since I cut my drawers slightly wider than they needed to be, I should end up with a last piece that needs to be trimmed just a little tiny bit. So technically it's a smaller drawer face than the other 2, but it's such a little difference that your eye can't see it. But what it does do is allow me to make consistent gaps that go all the way around, and that's something that your eye is a lot more likely to pick up on. Here I'm making the back panel, and I made this out of 4 pieces so that I could leave a gap that ran the length of the piece slightly above and below the shelf line. And this will leave plenty of room for somebody to pull cables through. Somehow I forgot to film myself attaching it, but it's just a couple screws. To attach the base to the legs, I'm going to use some of these figure 8 clips. And I'm not really looking for strength here. Gravity's going to be doing most of the work. I really just need something to keep the base in place. When I built the predecessor to this piece, at the end of the video, I had this little monologue about the idea that form follows function.